Something that I've always found absolutely crazy is how Stalin didn't see Hitler's invasion coming. In June of 1941, it was obvious that Nazi Germany was about to invade the Soviet Union. There was an enormous military buildup on the border. 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and thousands of aircraft were in position, ready to cross the border at a moment's notice. Soviet spies were totally aware of the buildup. Their reports poured into Moscow, warning that invasion was imminent. Some of them even predicted the correct date that it would happen. However, Stalin flatly refused to believe that Nazi Germany was about to invade. When, in one meeting, he was presented with evidence that the Germans were about to attack, he exploded in anger, shouting that the source of the intelligence should be sent, and I quote, to his fucking mother. The fact that Stalin trusted Hitler not to invade is, in my view, absolutely crazy. For decades, Hitler had openly expressed his desire to expand eastwards, to give Germany what was known as Lebensraum, or living space. In his notorious book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, Hitler made absolutely clear of his hatred of communism and the Slavic race. If all that wasn't enough evidence, in the months leading up to the invasion, Hitler had rejected Soviet requests to make a formal alliance with Germany and Italy. Overall, to anyone with any common sense, it was absolutely obvious that Nazi Germany was about to invade, and yet Stalin refused to believe it. Even after the invasion had actually started and those 3 million troops began to pour over the border, Stalin still refused to accept reality. He actually clung on to the absurd belief that the attack hadn't been approved by Hitler. He wanted to believe that it was an unofficial operation by some rogue German generals. In a meeting with his top ministers, he actually said, and this is a direct quote, "Hitler surely doesn't know about this." In fact, Stalin was so sure that it couldn't have been approved by Hitler that he actually proposed reaching out to the German ambassador to resolve what he desperately hoped was just a misunderstanding. It wasn't until the enormous scale of the invasion became clear that Stalin finally accepted the truth. Hitler had betrayed him. In a state of shock and denial, he left Moscow and retreated to the countryside. The question of today's video is why? Why didn't Stalin see the seemingly obvious invasion coming? How did Hitler manage to fool this otherwise untrusting and cynical man? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But first, let's have an overview of the history, the build-up to Operation Barbarossa. Before that, I'd like to tell you about the sponsor of today's video. It's a book titled simply The Book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding a Civilization. When the book's publisher, Hungry Minds, first reached out to me about sponsoring a video, I wasn't really sure. After all, £100 for a book does seem rather expensive. However, then I noticed how good the reviews are on Amazon, and that made me more interested. Then, after receiving a copy of the book, I understood why it has such great reviews. It really is very nicely done, with beautiful animations and really high-quality rustic paper. It claims to be the ultimate guide to rebuilding civilization, and that is exactly what it is. It's written as a step-by-step guide for how to make all the technologies that humanity has developed over the past few thousand years. For example, this is how it explains how to make bricks. Building your civilization brick by brick is not as difficult as it may sound. In fact, it's a very simple and cost-effective building material. All you need is clay and heat. But not just any clay will work, it needs to be compacted and slightly frozen. As you can see, it's written to be very easy to understand, and I think it's the absolute perfect gift for a child, particularly a science-minded child. The book covers all of the major scientific breakthroughs and discoveries, everything that's brought humanity from being hunter-gatherers to the 21st century. Use the link in the description to get your own copy. In the aftermath of World War I, Soviet-German relations were actually fairly good. Both countries had something important in common. They were both treated as secondary powers in the peace treaties that followed the war. At the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to accept all sorts of humiliating demands. It was forced to pay reparations, accept blame for the war, and severely limit the size of its military. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, didn't even get a seat at the negotiating table. At the same time, Britain and France placed severe trade restrictions on it because it was communist. It was that common resentment that brought the two nations together. 4 years after the end of the war, they re-established diplomatic relations and agreed to cooperate militarily. One very important part of the agreement was that it allowed German officers to train in the Soviet Union. That was very good for the Germans, as it meant they could get around the restrictions that they had agreed to at Versailles. Relations between the two states remained good, and over the next few years they actually signed 2 more treaties. However, things began to change when the Nazis came to power in 1933. The two nations now followed totally contradictory ideologies, and their relationship began to deteriorate. Hitler hated communism. In his book, Mein Kampf, he made absolutely clear that he wanted to eradicate it completely. Right after he came to power, he banned the Soviet-backed Communist Party and imprisoned all its members. He also closed Soviet companies and arrested Soviet citizens. However, all that said, Hitler didn't want war with the Soviet Union, at least not yet. Throughout the 1930s, Nazi Germany grew stronger and stronger. It was rearming fast and using its rebuilt military to exert its power. In 1936, it sent troops into the Rhineland, which had been a demilitarized zone under the Treaty of Versailles. Then, in 1938, it annexed Austria. That was another violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany seemed to be stronger than ever, and it wasn't afraid to show it. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, seemed weak. Only a few years earlier, it had suffered a huge famine that killed up to 9 million people. Also, Stalin, the Soviet Union's all-powerful despot, was purging the most capable and experienced members of the military. With war looking ever more likely, it was clear that the Soviet Union was in an extremely vulnerable position. Recognizing that, Stalin desperately tried to make a military alliance with Britain and France. However, the negotiations didn't get anywhere. Britain and France didn't trust Stalin and were concerned about the spread of communism. The negotiations dragged on but didn't make any progress. Eventually, Stalin realized that there was never going to be an alliance with Britain and France. That led him to completely change plan. In a surprising twist, he decided to make an alliance with Nazi Germany. That led to a new agreement between the two countries, the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact. Although it was called merely a non-aggression pact, it was essentially an alliance. It not only ruled out war between the two powers, but also secretly divided up Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Just 1 week later, that agreement was put into effect when Germany invaded Poland. The Soviet Union took its agreed-upon share of Poland soon after. For the next 2 years, the two nations cooperated extremely closely. The Soviet Union supplied Germany with a huge amount of raw materials. That massively boosted Germany's military production, helping it enormously in its campaigns in Western Europe. In exchange, Germany provided the Soviets with state-of-the-art military and industrial equipment. It was an incredibly beneficial relationship for both sides. In fact, the two became so close that there were even negotiations held about the Soviets potentially making a formal alliance with Nazi Germany and Italy. In November of 1940, Soviet diplomat Molotov visited Berlin and personally met Hitler to discuss joining the Axis alliance. However, Hitler refused the idea. He wouldn't agree to some of Stalin's territorial demands, and so the talks came to nothing. That was the beginning of the end of the partnership between the two countries. Only a few weeks later, in December of 1940, Hitler issued Directive Number 21, authorizing the biggest military campaign in human history. It was codenamed Operation Barbarossa. Nazi Germany was going to invade the Soviet Union. Hitler and the Nazis thought that the invasion would be easy. In only 6 weeks, they'd conquered France, which was a much more advanced nation. Surely defeating the Soviet Union would be easier. Secret preparations began immediately. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, Nazi Germany amassed a huge army along the enormous German-Soviet border. It was made up of over 3 million men. It was absolutely impossible to hide. Despite that, Stalin remained convinced that Hitler wouldn't attack. Even when his spies told him that invasion was imminent, he refused to believe it. Eventually, on the morning of June 22nd, 1941, the invasion started. German tanks and infantry began to pour across the border and made swift progress into the Soviet Union. In just 1 month, the Germans had captured almost 1 million Soviet soldiers and destroyed almost all of the Soviet Air Force. Hitler had betrayed Stalin. After explicitly promising not to attack the Soviet Union, he had done just that. The Soviet Union was now forced to fight the biggest battle in human history if it was to avoid being totally conquered by Nazi Germany. So, that is what happened. Despite the obvious signs, Stalin didn't see the invasion coming. So, why not? Why couldn't he see what was so clearly obvious? Well, before answering that question, I'd like to persuade you that I'm not exaggerating when I say that it was obvious. It really was. First, let's look at all the things that Hitler said in the decades before the invasion. He had made his hatred of both communism and the Slavic race crystal clear. For example, in his book Mein Kampf, he wrote at length about how much he hated the Soviet Union. In his words, Soviet leaders were common blood-stained criminals, the scum of humanity. He then accused them of carrying out the most cruel and tyrannical regime of all time. Later in the book, he wrote, "It is sheer lunacy to ally ourselves with a power whose master is the mortal enemy of our future." Stalin and the other Soviet leaders were absolutely aware of all those statements. They were, after all, easily available in a public book. It would be reasonable to argue that since those statements were written about 15 years earlier, it was somewhat understandable for the Soviets not to take them seriously. However, Hitler had continued expressing those same views much more recently, even after he became Germany's leader. In 1934, he declared that the defense of Europe against Bolshevism is our task for the next 200 or 300 years. He wasn't secretive about his views. As late as 1939, he told the High Commissioner for the League of Nations exactly what he planned to do. He said, "Everything that I undertake is directed against Russia. If those in the West are too stupid and too blind to understand this, then I shall be forced to come to an understanding with the Russians to beat the West, and then, after its defeat, turn all my concerted force against the Soviet Union. I need Ukraine so that no one will starve us out as they did in the last war." As you can see, he could not have been clearer. However, even aside from those very public statements about his intentions, there were other reasons to think that invasion was imminent in June of 1941. Another signal was the fact that Hitler had refused to let the Soviets join the Axis. The Axis was an alliance of dictatorial regimes, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Initially, it was just an alliance between Germany and Italy in 1936. Then, in 1940, Japan joined. Many at the time believed that the next logical step was to incorporate the Soviet Union. It, too, was a dictatorial regime. It had a close economic relationship with Germany, and its huge army would have dramatically increased the alliance's military power. In September of 1940, negotiations began for the Soviets to join. The Nazis proposed to Stalin that the Axis powers would divide the world up like this. Japan would take all of Asia and Australia, while Italy would get northeastern Africa and the Middle East. The Soviets would get all of Central Asia and India. Stalin pretty much agreed to the plan, but with one alteration. He wanted Bulgaria to become part of the Soviet sphere of influence. Some of the Germans wanted to agree to the deal. German negotiator Karl Schnorre telegrammed Berlin saying, and I quote, "In view of the present status of the negotiations here, Molotov's statements today must be viewed as a surprising indication of goodwill on the part of the Soviet government." The important Nazi diplomat Ribbentrop was also in favor of accepting the deal. However, Hitler didn't see the Soviet response the same way. He said to his top military chiefs that Stalin demands more and more. He's a cold-blooded blackmailer. He then went on to say that Russia must be brought to her knees as soon as possible. In truth, Hitler had probably already decided to invade the Soviet Union. In fact, he had actually already presented an invasion plan to his military advisors 2 months earlier. In November, he halted negotiations with the Soviet Union, and 3 weeks later, he signed Directive Number 21, which ordered the military to prepare for the invasion. Of course, the Soviets didn't know that the deal to divide up the world was off. In fact, in January of 1941, the Russian diplomat Molotov actually inquired as to why Germany hadn't responded to the Soviet counterproposal. Hitler gave no clear answer. It was no small clue that he had chosen war. To make the message even clearer, in March of 1941, Bulgaria joined the Axis alliance. If you remember, it was because Stalin wanted control of Bulgaria that he actually declined Hitler's initial plan to divide up the world. The fact that Hitler had now let Bulgaria into the Axis, but not the Soviet Union, was a huge statement. Finally, there was a third, glaringly obvious signal that invasion was imminent: the enormous military buildup. That actually began almost a full year before the invasion actually happened. As early as July of 1940, the Soviet secret police told Stalin that the Germans had started constructing new airfields close to the border. The next month, there were reports that the Germans were going to send about 120 divisions, or 1.5 million soldiers, to the frontier. Over the next few months, all manner of very visible preparations got underway. Civilian facilities were converted into barracks. Fortifications and anti-aircraft defenses were built. The railways were significantly upgraded. As more and more German troops arrived at the border, there were more incidents where they would exchange fire with Soviet troops. In the first half of 1940, there were 22 incidents. In the second half, there were 187. As 1940 became 1941, the signs of what was going to happen became even more glaringly obvious. The railways were operating at full capacity to transport troops, artillery, and ammunition to the frontier. In the month of April alone, the Soviet authorities recorded 43 violations of Soviet airspace by German aircraft. Sometimes they penetrated as far as 220 kilometers inside Soviet territory. The violations only increased as the months went by. At the same time, Nazi-occupied Poland was very conspicuously prepared for the invasion. Cities like Warsaw and Lublin were full of German soldiers. Roads were repaired and bridges were strengthened to be able to support tanks. The Germans also increased their intelligence gathering of the Soviet defenses. Many of the German spies were caught. Over 200 German spies were caught crossing the border in 1941. By the night of the invasion, the build-up was absolutely huge. It was the biggest invasion force in human history. There were 3.5 million troops, 600,000 vehicles, 3,500 tanks, and 7,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 3,000 aircraft, all stationed right up against the Soviet border. To call it conspicuous is a wild understatement. All in all, I think we can absolutely say that it was obvious that the invasion was about to happen. In Hitler, there was a man who had openly expressed his hatred of the Soviet Union repeatedly over the course of decades. In the years before, he had invaded and conquered about 10 countries. Some of them he had invaded after previously promising that he wouldn't. Now he had amassed an enormous army on the border of the Soviet Union. Overall, to not be able to see what was about to happen was, frankly, insane. So, if it was so obvious what was going to happen, why didn't Stalin expect it? Well, first, I want to address the question of whether it's actually true that he didn't expect it. This is actually quite a complicated question, and there's no clear yes or no answer. I think you can make the case both that he did and that he didn't expect it, and that is exactly what I'm going to do now. First, I'll make the case that he did. Perhaps the best piece of evidence that Stalin did expect the invasion is that in the years leading up to it, he massively built up the Soviet military. It's often overlooked, but at the time of the invasion, the Soviet Union had the world's largest army and the most tanks and aircraft. Now, in fairness, much of that equipment was very outdated, but in terms of sheer numbers, it had more stuff than any other country. That is simply because, for a decade, Stalin had been preparing the Soviet Union for war. As early as 1934, Before Germany had started expanding, and while the world was still relatively peaceful, the Soviets had 3,500 tanks. For comparison, that is 1,000 more than the total number of tanks that the Germans used to invade France in 1940. Throughout the 1930s, Stalin dramatically increased military spending. In 1933, it was 16% of the government's budget. 5 years later, in 1938, it was a whopping 43%, almost half of all government spending. Needless to say, for a nation not at war, that is an astronomical figure. So, who did Stalin have in mind when he was building this enormous military? There are only two options that make any sense: Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. With Japan, the Soviet Union had actually had quite a few minor border conflicts throughout the 1930s. It was an expansionist, aggressive power, so there was at least some chance that they would invade. Really though, I think we can be pretty sure that Stalin was spending so much money on the Soviet military because he was preparing for war against Nazi Germany. The vast majority of his army was stationed on the western border. In early 1941, before the Nazis invaded, the Soviets had about 2.5 million troops there. Needless to say, there would be no reason for Stalin to put so many troops there if he thought war was definitely not going to happen. The only reason to do so would be to defend against invasion. If Stalin did truly trust Hitler and truly believed in the non-aggression pact, why would he be spending almost half of the Soviet budget on the military? All that money could have been much better spent on other things. Building up the military wasn't the only way that Stalin was preparing for war. Something else that he did was to annex various regions because he wanted to use them as buffer states. In June of 1940, he annexed the 3 Baltic states. According to the non-aggression pact with Germany, those states were within the Soviet sphere of influence, so it was totally permitted for the Soviet Union to invade them. However, initially, Stalin had refrained from doing so, wanting to avoid international condemnation from the West. Then, when France fell and the prospect of war with Germany became more likely, Stalin decided to go ahead with the annexation. To leave those countries to be independent was a big risk for the Soviets. If the Germans took them, they would be able to get extremely close to St. Petersburg, the second most important city in the Soviet Union. In June of 1940, just after the fall of France, Stalin went ahead with the annexation, securing himself a crucial buffer zone. A similar thing happened in Bessarabia, modern-day Moldova. At the time, the region was part of Romania, but after the fall of France, Stalin wanted that to be a buffer zone as well. He sent the Romanians an ultimatum demanding that they cede the region or face military action. The Romanians accepted the demands, and so the Soviet military moved in to secure the region. Those land grabs by Stalin happened just after the fall of France, and that is no coincidence. We actually have quotes that show that after France fell, the prospect of war with Germany was very much on Stalin's mind. One quote is in the memoir of Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor as Soviet leader. Apparently, after hearing about the fall of France in 1940, Stalin let fly with some choice Russian curses and said how now Hitler was sure to beat our brains in. So, that is some evidence that Stalin was expecting Hitler to invade. Now I want to make the case that he wasn't. Here again, we have quotes to support the idea. I mentioned earlier about the time that one of his staff told him that there was intelligence saying that the invasion was imminent, and he then cursed the official and told him to send the intelligence to his effing mother. Then, after the invasion happened, he said, Hitler surely doesn't know about this. Another great quote is from just a few days before the invasion. At that point, his generals were pleading with him to put the Soviet military on high alert. Stalin responded by getting angry. He said, "We have a non-aggression pact with Germany. Germany is up to its neck in war in the West, and I am certain that Hitler would not risk opening a second front by attacking us. Hitler is not an idiot. He knows the Soviet Union is not Poland, not France, and not even England." Another piece of evidence that Stalin didn't expect the invasion is the fact that the Soviet Union continued sending raw material to Germany right up until the invasion. They were literally giving the Germans the resources that they needed in order to fight them. When I say that the shipments continued right up until the morning of the invasion, I'm not exaggerating. In fact, one train carrying raw materials actually crossed the border into Nazi Germany after the invasion had already started. The train crew were unaware that they were at war, and they proceeded as scheduled, only to be quickly captured by the Germans. The amount of raw material that Nazi Germany was getting from the Soviets is absolutely enormous. In the 18 months leading up to the invasion, the Soviet Union sent 1.5 million tons of grain, almost 1 million tons of oil, and a whole variety of other valuable commodities. Those supplies were absolutely crucial for Nazi Germany. Britain had imposed a naval blockade, which would have been crippling if Germany wasn't able to get so many raw materials from the Soviet Union. Another reason to think that Stalin wasn't expecting the invasion is that just a few years before, he had dramatically weakened the Soviet military in what was known as the Great Purge. Between May of 1937 and September of 1938, Stalin had around 40,000 officers put on trial for made-up crimes and then executed. That dramatically weakened the fighting ability of the military. By the end of the purge, an astonishing 75% of the officers had been in active service for less than a year. Needless to say, having so many inexperienced officers in its ranks was catastrophic for the Soviet military. About 2 years after the purge ended, they fought against Finland in the so-called Winter War. The Soviet military performed extremely badly. There were some battles that they lost, even though they significantly outnumbered the enemy. At the Battle of Rat Road, they outnumbered the Finns about 3-1, but still lost and took a huge number of casualties. At the Battle of Taipale, the clumsy Soviet advances were met with devastating artillery and machine gun fire. The Soviets lost about 10,000 men without gaining anything. That poor performance was directly related to Stalin's purge 2 years before. The inexperienced Soviet officers often just sent their men into suicidal mass frontal assaults. The Finnish defenders were able to exploit those predictable tactics and set up ambushes. By the time the war was over, the Soviets had lost about 5 times as many men as the Finns. They had suffered about 350,000 casualties to Finland's 70,000. The Soviet leadership were aware that that was in large part because they had a huge number of incompetent commanders in the military. According to their assessment, about 40% of the officers were, in their words, idiots, characterless, and cowards. That was all because of Stalin's purge. It seems almost inexplicable that Stalin would have damaged the Soviet military so much if he was expecting a war with Nazi Germany to break out at any moment. Finally, perhaps the biggest piece of evidence that Stalin didn't expect the invasion is that he did almost nothing to get the military ready to defend against it. If he was expecting Germany to attack, there are all sorts of things that you would expect him to do. You would expect a full mobilization of the military, including conscription. Defenses could have been built, such as anti-tank ditches. A huge number of mines could have been laid over the vast countryside. A strategy of scorched earth could have been used, with factories and other economic assets moved east so that they wouldn't fall into German hands. Stalin didn't do any of that. In fact, he actually forbade his generals from preparing. That gave rise to the absurd situation where the Soviet commanders were preparing for the obviously imminent war in secret. Marshal Zhukov, one of the highest-ranking commanders, encouraged his local commanders to make any preparations that they wanted to, but not do anything that would anger Stalin. When the Germans did finally invade, the Soviet defenses were woefully underprepared. The German troops actually found that only about 200 of about 1,000 forts were equipped and occupied. There were actually millions of Soviet troops on the border, but they were extremely badly positioned. Instead of waiting in well-defended, fortified positions deep inside Soviet territory, the troops were stretched out in a thin line next to the front. That left them extremely little time to react effectively and made them very easy to surround and capture. Another problem was that the Soviet divisions were under strength. A Soviet rifle division was meant to have about 15,000 men, but at the time of the invasion, most of them only had about 10,000. That is because the government had been very slow to call up the reservists. It was only 1 month before that they called up 800,000 men, but most of those men didn't have time to get to their units by the time of the German attack. That lack of preparation was a big reason that the Germans were so successful initially. Within just 8 hours of starting the invasion, they had destroyed 1,200 Soviet aircraft. Within a week, that number was 4,600, nearly a quarter of the entire fleet. The vast majority of those aircraft were destroyed on the ground. If Stalin had allowed them to prepare for war, those aircraft could have been ready to fight, and even though they were outdated, at least they would have made it into the air. As you can see, whether Stalin was or wasn't expecting the invasion isn't an easy question to answer. That said, I think something that we can say for certain is that in June of 1941, he wasn't treating it as anywhere near as obvious as he might have been. So, now for the question of the video. Why not? One reason is that, quite simply, for Nazi Germany to invade the Soviet Union didn't make any logical sense. I mentioned earlier that Hitler was getting a huge amount of raw materials from Stalin. Well, if he invaded, that would all end. Germany was relying heavily on Soviet supplies to sustain its war against Britain. It did have a lot to lose by invading. In fact, just 1 month before the invasion, Stalin actually found out that the German Minister for the Economy had said that Nazi Germany had to widen its economic ties with the Soviet Union. Surely Hitler wouldn't do something so rash as to bite the hand that was feeding him. In some ways, I think Stalin underestimated how ideological Hitler was. Stalin himself was very ideological, fanatically committed to his communist ideology. However, he could also be quite a pragmatist. In negotiations, he understood how much power he had, and he didn't overplay his hand. I think potentially Stalin assumed that Hitler would be the same, that he would be rational and not want to lose all the material that he was getting. That might be one reason that Stalin didn't see the invasion coming. However, that still leaves one important question. How did Stalin explain away the enormous military buildup on the border? What could those forces be doing other than preparing for an invasion? Well, essentially, Stalin thought that rather than invade, Nazi Germany was going to use those forces to blackmail the Soviet Union. The idea was that Hitler would threaten to invade in order to get more concessions out of the Soviets. In the words of Stalin, the actual initiation of military activities will be preceded by an ultimatum to the Soviet government. He thought that Hitler would demand more resources and maybe more land. He thought that the Germans would only invade if he refused their demands. Many of the Soviet intelligence reports actually backed up that idea. Nearly half of them suggested that war wasn't inevitable and that the Germans actually wanted diplomacy. The Soviet intelligence wrote off rumors that Nazi Germany was about to invade, saying that they were, quote-unquote, to produce an atmosphere of nervousness in Moscow, to prepare the ground for an attempt to squeeze further accommodation from the Soviet government. That error by the Soviet spies was far from the only one. In fact, the Soviet intelligence service performed extremely badly in the lead-up to the invasion. Some of them were actually telling Stalin that it wasn't going to happen. One of the most incompetent was actually the head of the Soviet intelligence service, Vsevolod Merkulov. For example, in December of 1940, just as Hitler was issuing the first orders to invade the Soviet Union, Soviet spies in Berlin began to get information about it. The Soviet ambassador even received an anonymous letter which contained detailed information about the invasion plans. The spies did try to inform Moscow. One of them explicitly told Moscow that invasion was coming and that his information was, in his words, not based on rumors, but on a special written directive by Hitler. However, the head of Soviet intelligence dismissed the information. He told the agent, "You are greatly exaggerating." As the months went on and the invasion became ever more obvious, the head of intelligence continued to deny that it was going to happen. On May the 25th, less than a month before the invasion, he informed Stalin that 200 German divisions were concentrated on the Soviet border. However, he then downplayed the significance of that, telling Stalin that war was unlikely because, in his words, Hitler cannot risk war with the Soviet Union for fear of violating the unity of the Nazi Party. As foolish as the head of intelligence was, he was far from the only one. Many other spies were also saying totally incorrect things. One worker at an electricity factory in Berlin, who was considered a reliable source, insisted that Hitler was seeking a 90-year trade agreement with the Soviet Union. Supposedly, in exchange for that, Germany would allow the Soviet Union to take control of Turkey and Finland. Another source, a German officer turned Soviet spy, claimed that if a German attack were to happen, it would be limited and would merely serve as a warning. Of course, those reports were not only false, but totally absurd. Who in their right mind would believe that Germany, already fighting a war in the West, would amass 3 million troops on the Soviet border just to secure a trade agreement? So, why were the Soviet intelligence agents coming out with such crazy statements? Why were they so incompetent? The answer is something that I mentioned before, Stalin's Great Purge of 1936. That severely disrupted Soviet intelligence networks. During that period of chaotic, irrational violence, many experienced agents were executed or dismissed, leaving the service staffed with inexperienced and poorly trained officers. For example, one of the most important positions was head of the Secret Service in Berlin. For that job, you would want the best of the best, but instead the position was held by a man named Amiak Kobylov, who was inexperienced and utterly incompetent. Kobylov failed to establish new intelligence networks in Berlin and instead relied on old contacts that the Nazis already knew about. That wasn't the worst part. In fact, one of the sources that Kobylov thought was most reliable was actually a double agent, feeding the Kremlin false information. Ribbentrop, the high-ranking Nazi, actually boasted, "We can pump whatever information we want into that agent." Of course, all that information was making its way back to Moscow. Aside from being incompetent, another problem with the Soviet spies is that they were too afraid of Stalin, and in particular, afraid to tell him bad news. In fairness, they were right to be afraid. Stalin did have people fired if they told him things that he didn't want to hear. For example, when a newly appointed chief of staff warned Stalin that the army wasn't ready to fight the Germans, Stalin was furious. He replied that the real problem was that the chief of staff was incompetent and promptly had him replaced. That sort of behavior meant that the reports that reached Stalin were carefully filtered to align with his wishful thinking. He was given a false picture that everything was under control. At times, intelligence statements were actually changed so as not to anger Stalin. In May of 1941, a Soviet agent briefed Moscow that Hitler had decided to attack the Soviet Union and annex its European territories. His statement was altered so that it implied that there was room for negotiation to change Hitler's mind. Eventually, the Kremlin became an echo chamber where groupthink ruled. The theories became fantastical. One theory had it that all the reports of German invasion were part of a British plot to worsen relations between Hitler and Stalin. Molotov actually said to the Japanese ambassador, "The rumors of an impending German attack are simply British and American propaganda and entirely without foundation." As you can see, the Soviet intelligence was in a state of complete disarray before the German invasion, which made it very difficult for the Soviets to know what was going on. That said, it wasn't just that the Soviets were incompetent. The German intelligence actually did a very good job. They managed to spread a huge amount of disinformation, which confused the Soviets even more. In fact, Joseph Goebbels, the infamous Nazi minister for propaganda, was so proud of this accomplishment that he wrote in his diary, "We have been successful in producing a tremendous torrent of false reports. The newspapers' speculations have confused issues, and they can no longer confirm what is true and what is false. This is the atmosphere we need." Indeed, the Germans constructed an elaborate web of deception, combining outright lies, denials, and contradictory information to completely confuse the Soviets. So, those are a few factors that go some way to explaining the seemingly inexplicable fact that Stalin didn't treat the invasion as obvious when it very clearly was. In some ways, I actually think that rather than thinking that Stalin soberly believed that Hitler wouldn't invade, it was much more the case that he was simply in denial. That is understandable. For the Soviet Union, getting invaded by Nazi Germany was, to put it mildly, extremely bad news. Because we know what happened and have hindsight, it's easy to think that the Soviets' victory over Germany was a given, that it was always going to happen. It's important to remember that when Operation Barbarossa happened and those 3 million men crossed the border, it was anything but certain that the Soviets would win. Germany had just subjugated about 10 countries, including France, one of the most advanced countries of the age. It definitely wouldn't have seemed certain to anyone that the Soviets would eventually triumph. Even Winston Churchill assumed that the Soviet Union would be defeated fairly quickly. Regular viewers of the channel will know that I actually did a video all about how Nazi Germany could have defeated the Soviets. One of the main arguments I made in that video is that if America hadn't supported the Soviet Union, there is a good chance that it would have lost. That video actually got a lot of pushback in the comments. Many people were adamant that there was no way that Hitler could have won. Despite all that, I absolutely stand by what I said in the video. One of the reasons that I'm so confident is that there's someone who agrees with me who knows really rather a lot about the topic. He's a man you might have heard of. His name is Joseph Stalin. That's right, Stalin explicitly said that without the support of America, the Soviets would have lost the war. The quote is from the Tehran Conference of November of 1943. The Allied leaders were at dinner to celebrate Churchill's birthday, and Stalin said this: "The most important things in this war are machines. The United States has proven that it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 aeroplanes per month. Russia can only turn out at most 3,000 per month. England turns out between 3 or 3,500, which are mostly heavy bombers. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the use of those machines through Lend-Lease, we would lose this war." Perhaps that quote won't be enough to persuade all the military experts in the YouTube comments. After all, Stalin was a politician, not a military man. Surely they know more about it than him. If that's the case, then let's hear from a man who absolutely was a military expert, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov also said that the Soviet Union would have lost the war without American support. In 1963, in an interview with a war correspondent, he said, "Today, some say the Allies didn't really help us. But listen, one cannot deny that the Americans shipped to us material without which we could not have equipped our armies held in reserve or been able to continue the war." Just in case you like one more quote, here is another one from Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev. He said, "I would like to express my candid opinion about Stalin's views on whether the Red Army and the Soviet Union could have coped with Nazi Germany and survived the war without aid from the United States and Britain. First, I would like to tell about some remarks Stalin made and repeated several times when we were discussing freely amongst ourselves. He stated bluntly that if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. If we had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could not have stood up against Germany's pressure and we would have lost the war. When I listened to Stalin's remarks, I was fully in agreement with him, and today I am even more so." So, why am I bringing this up? The reason that it's relevant to this video is because during the build-up and the immediate aftermath of the German invasion of Russia, there was absolutely no reason to think that America would ever come to the aid of the Soviet Union. At that time, America wasn't involved in the war, and it wasn't clear that it was ever going to be. It had watched as France, a country to which it had historic ties, was subjugated by Nazi Germany and not come to her aid. It had started shipping military aid to Britain, but had only been doing so for a mere 3 months. Of course, what actually got America into the war was the attack by Japan at Pearl Harbor 6 months after Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Needless to say, there is absolutely no way that Stalin or the Soviet leaders could have known that that attack would ever happen. Without that attack, America might never have come to the aid of the Soviet Union. In summary, what I'm really trying to persuade you is that on June the 22nd, 1941, when those 3 million Germans began to invade the Soviet Union, it was extremely possible, perhaps even probable, that the Soviet Union would actually lose. Only a year before, they had only just been able to win a war against Finland. Now they were up against a military that had defeated France in only 6 weeks. I think when we keep those facts in mind and really put ourselves in Stalin's shoes, his behavior becomes a lot more understandable. If he thought that there was a very good chance that they would lose the war, it suddenly makes total sense that he wanted to do absolutely everything to try to avoid provoking Nazi Germany. That was definitely part of the reason that he was so determined not to prepare the military, because he thought it would provoke Hitler. There is actually a great quote to support that. It was something Stalin said to his defense minister, Timoshenko, after Timoshenko suggested that the Soviet Union should build up its defenses on the border. Stalin humiliated him in front of the leadership, saying, "Timoshenko is a fine man with a big head, but apparently a small brain. He is preparing everyone for war, and he ought to have been shot for this. If anyone provokes the Germans by moving troops without my permission, heads will roll, mark my words." As you can see, Stalin's top priority was to not provoke the Germans, and if we consider that it was very possible that the Germans would win the war, that makes total sense. I think when we bear it in mind, other things make more sense too. It becomes completely understandable that Stalin continued the shipments of raw materials to Germany. It was all part of this desperate attempt to stop them invading. It also explains some of Stalin's behavior after the invasion actually started. When he left Moscow and retreated to his country house, perhaps he was abandoning his post not out of shock or surprise, but actually out of simple defeatism. Perhaps he basically thought it was all over. Similarly, when we hear an absurd statement from him like, "Surely Hitler doesn't know about this," I don't think we should interpret it as a sober assessment of what he actually thought was most likely. Rather, it was an expression of a man desperately clinging to the hope that the terrifying reality that he could see before him wasn't really true.